Before his sudden death during post-production on Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick had planned to follow it with AI, artificial intelligence, a passion project he had been developing for close to 2 decades. After his passing, close friend and fellow filmmaker Steven Spielberg stepped in to direct and bring the film to life. Given the stark differences in their styles, many fans couldn't help but wonder how different would AI have been if Kubrick had lived to direct it himself. To find out, let's dive in and take a look at what could have been Stanley Kubrick's artificial intelligence. 1 year after 2001: A Space Odyssey, author Brian Aldiss released a short story called Supertoys Last All Summer Long, about a young boy named David living in a future where families must request permission to bear children due to overpopulation. Monica, David's mother, struggles to connect with him emotionally, while David questions his reality and whether his mother truly loves him. As Monica learns they've been approved to have a real child, it's revealed that David isn't human at all, but an artificial boy, unknowingly living in place of the child she was never allowed to have. After seeing Star Wars, a film Kubrick disliked and didn't believe matched the sophistication of 2001, he began to wonder what kind of science fiction film could he make that would have the massive box office success of Star Wars while still preserving the social depth and artistic integrity he was known for. 2001 may have been groundbreaking, but it barely made a dent commercially compared to George Lucas's blockbuster. And despite their critical acclaim, Kubrick's films were rarely major financial hits. That question eventually led him to Supertoys, as a story of a little boy's inability to please his mother touched Kubrick's heart. To adapt the short story into a film, Kubrick initially turned to its author, Brian Aldiss, but their collaboration quickly veered off course. Aldiss's early concept strayed far from his original tale, possibly influenced by Kubrick's desire to craft a large-scale sci-fi epic in the vein of Star Wars. In this version, David is kidnapped by Russian intelligence and taken to an orbiting prison satellite. After a jailbreak, he joins a group of political dissidents and is listed in a plot to kidnap the Russian premier. David is tasked with building a bomb, but it detonates prematurely. The story ends with David drifting through space, only to be discovered years later and placed in a museum inside a replica of his childhood home, where a robotic surrogate mother holds him in an eternal embrace. Kubrick, however, was ultimately dissatisfied with this direction. What he wanted was a modern retelling of Pinocchio, a deeply emotional story in which David, the android boy, meets the blue fairy and becomes a real boy himself. In fact, Kubrick never even referred to the project as AI. He always called it Pinocchio. Aldiss, on the other hand, hoped Kubrick would craft a new kind of fairy tale rather than rework an old one. Their creative visions ultimately clashed, and Kubrick moved on to other projects before eventually bringing Aldiss back for another attempt. This second version bore a much closer resemblance to what would become the finished film. Instead of being abandoned in the forest, David is returned to the factory, where he meets a fellow mecha named G.I. Joe, a robotic soldier. The two escape and journey to Tin Town, a bleak scrapyard settlement for obsolete and discarded robots. There, robots are forced to work under brutal conditions until they physically fall apart, an environment Kubrick deliberately modeled after a concentration camp, highlighting the dehumanizing fate of machines that once mimicked humanity. Author Ian Watson was brought in to take a fresh pass at the material, and his treatment leaned heavily into classic sci-fi tropes, delivering an ending that echoed the cosmic ambition of 2001: A Space Odyssey. In this version, called Foxtrot, David runs away after learning that his mom is pregnant with a real child, fearing he'll be replaced. He accidentally falls into a vault and is discovered far in the future, at a time when humanity is on the brink of extinction and locked in conflict with the mechas. David's final wish is to be reincarnated using his mother's DNA. The story ends with the creation of a new being, a girl who is part David, part his mother, who becomes a bridge between humans and machines, guiding both toward a future of peace and understanding. Kubrick appreciated Watson's ambitious take, but ultimately felt it wasn't the right direction for the film. Still, he was impressed enough to keep Watson on board to help further develop the screenplay. Watson went on to contribute several key elements, including the flesh fair sequence and a more subtle, dry tone for the robot's dialogue, modeled after Peter Sellers' character in Being There, speaking in a matter-of-fact, almost detached manner. Watson also proposed transforming G.I. Joe into a gigolo mecha, a bold shift that forced Kubrick to jokingly admit, "I guess we lost the kiddie market." But what the hell? However, after working with Watson, Kubrick felt he needed yet another fresh set of eyes on the project, and approached Arthur C. Clarke, his former collaborator on 2001: A Space Odyssey, and asked if he'd be willing to write a treatment. Clarke responded with a short outline titled Child of the Sun, which imagined David being deactivated and reawakened 160 years later to join an interstellar mission to contact an alien civilization. While imaginative, the story strayed far from the emotionally grounded narrative Kubrick envisioned, and covered ground the filmmaker already explored explored in 2001. In a characteristically blunt note, Kubrick told Clarke, "I fear you have not only thrown out the baby with the bathwater, but the bathtub, bathroom, and indeed the house itself." At this point, Kubrick decided to just write the film himself, and this version contains Kubrick's original ending. It should be noted that the ending of AI became one of the film's most controversial elements, with many fans criticizing it as overly sentimental and attributing it to Spielberg. However, you may be surprised to learn that the core concept behind the ending was always Kubrick's, even if it evolved slightly over the years. In the finished film, it's revealed that the advanced robots of the future believe humans hold the key to understanding the meaning of existence. To uncover that truth, they develop a project to resurrect humans from the past, but each attempt fails, as the resurrected only survive for a single day. When David's mother is brought back, they spend an idyllic day together. As they fall asleep together, the film ends on a bittersweet note, implying she too will die by morning. However, Kubrick originally wanted the story to continue. David goes to sleep, hoping for a miracle, and the next morning it comes true. His mom wakes up. For the first time, a resurrected human survives beyond a single day. The robots search for an explanation and wonder, was it the love of a robot child? Since no other resurrectee had ever before had someone who loved them hold on to them. The last shot of the film would have been David's mother joyfully waltzing around the room with him, as she had done the day of his imprinting. The ending continued to evolve after Kubrick brought on English novelist Sarah Maitland. In Maitland's version, the mother was an alcoholic, a woman for whom David would mix Bloody Marys in a futile attempt to earn her love. In Maitland's proposed ending, the advanced robots who now inhabit the Earth reconstruct David's old apartment from his memories. But because his recollections are subjective, the mother is rendered in vivid detail, while the father is more vaguely formed, and the stepsister's room is nothing more than a hole in the wall. Maitland envisioned the film ending with David preparing a Bloody Mary for his mother, the juice in a naturally bright red. He hears her voice off screen, and that's where the movie ends. No reunion on camera, just a suggestion of one. Kubrick, however, was committed to the idea that resurrected humans couldn't survive more than a single day. After abandoning his earlier notion of David's mother defying that limit through some miraculous exception, he instead opted for a more visually interesting ending. David sitting quietly at his mother's bedside, watching as she slowly disappears. Maitland strongly opposed this ending, arguing it broke a fundamental rule of fairy tales. You can't have a failed quest or a completed quest with no reward. Having David find his mother only to watch her disappear, she felt, rendered the emotional journey hollow and undermined the story's resolution. Still, she acknowledged it must have been a very strong visual thing for Kubrick to show the mother disappearing, because he wasn't usually stupid about story. One of the key reasons Kubrick spent so long developing AI, beyond his famously meticulous approach to story development, was the challenge of casting the lead character. He believed the role of David couldn't be played by a real child, as the extraordinary long shoots he was known for would cause a young actor to visibly age, undermining the illusion of an unchanging android boy. Instead, Kubrick considered building a lifelike, robotic child, enhanced with digital effects. But throughout the 80s, he felt that neither animatronics nor computer-generated imagery were advanced enough to convincingly realize the character. That changed when he saw Jurassic Park. For the first time, he believed the technology had caught up with his vision. Kubrick imagined David resembling Gainsborough's Blue Boy, an androgynous, porcelain-like Victorian child, with a perfectly symmetrical face that would subtly unsettle viewers. To bring this idea to life, Kubrick reached out to the visual and practical effects teams behind Jurassic Park, including ILM and Stan Winston, expressing his desire to create a full digital robot, complete with expressive facial animatronics. Although they told him it was possible, the early tests left Kubrick unimpressed, both in terms of quality and cost. As a result, Kubrick turned to Chris Cunningham, a rising special effects artist who would later gain notoriety for directing some of the most surreal and visually intense music videos of the era. Cunningham spent all of 1995 working at Kubrick's home on a single robot head prototype, but the end result proved disappointing. As a result, Kubrick decided to set AI aside once again. He felt the project had become too complex, requiring extensive visual effects, large crews, and a demanding production timeline that clashed with the challenge of casting a child who wouldn't visually age during the shoot. Instead, he directed Eyes Wide Shut and eyed another director to tackle AI. In the early 80s, after watching E.T. the Extraterrestrial, Kubrick recognized that AI was a story deeply suited to Spielberg's sensibilities. He began to see the project as being firmly in Spielberg's wheelhouse, sentimental, emotional, and childlike in a way that contrasted with his own colder, more cerebral approach. This realization led to an unlikely but close friendship between the two filmmakers, with Kubrick frequently calling Spielberg to bounce ideas off of him and seek creative input input. Their conversations often stretched into marathon 9-hour phone calls. Eventually, Kubrick convinced Spielberg to install a fax machine in his bedroom so they could exchange concept art and story ideas in private. However, the machine would buzz throughout the night until Spielberg's wife had finally had enough and threw it out of the room. As their collaboration deepened over the years, Kubrick began to seriously doubt whether AI was a film he should direct himself. He worried that his vision would come off as too cold and too philosophical, lacking the emotional warmth and accessibility that Spielberg could bring to the film. He repeatedly urged Spielberg to take the director's chair, but Spielberg always pushed back, insisting Kubrick was the one who should direct it. Kubrick would die of a heart attack during post-production on Eyes Wide Shut. At the time, Spielberg was preparing to direct Minority Report, but production was unexpectedly delayed when its star, Tom Cruise, fresh off of working with Kubrick, had to prioritize reshoots for Mission Impossible 2. With Spielberg's schedule opening up, the timing felt almost like fate, as Spielberg chose to direct AI. Drawing from Kubrick's decades of notes, story treatments, and visual planning, Spielberg even wrote the screenplay himself. And contrary to popular belief, despite the film's sentimentality being often attributed to Spielberg, AI remained remarkably faithful to Kubrick's original vision. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Bullets and Blockbusters for more great content.